We'll now continue with our next panel. For those tuning into today's meeting, we're exploring Bill C-21, an act to amend certain acts and to make certain consequential amendments, all related to the regulation of firearms in Canada. For this next hour, we have the pleasure of welcoming, both by video conference, Mr. Christian Leuprecht, Professor at the Department of Political Science and Economics at the Royal Military College of Canada, and Dr. Kaylin Langman, Assistant Program Director and Competence Committee Chair at the Department of Medicine at McMaster University. Thank you both for joining us today. We now invite you to provide your opening remarks, to be followed by questions from our members. I remind you that you each have 5 minutes for your testimony, and we will begin with Mr. Leuprecht. Whenever you are ready, please proceed.
Monsieur le Président, je vous remercie de l'invitation aujourd'hui. I live and work in Kingston, which is situated on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, and Haudenosaunee peoples. I direct a large empirical research program on global illicit flows. I've published on firearms policy. I'm a member of the Kingston Police Services Board, although I do not speak for the board, but I do not have a firearms license or certificate. The proposed legislation amounts to a creeping total ban on handguns. In effect, it replicates Section 12601 of the Firearms Act. Introduced by a previous Liberal government, this section prohibited previously restricted firearms with a barrel length of 105 millimeters or less that shoot calibers of certain types of calibers of ammunition. In April 2005, that amendment imposed a prohibition on firearms that had previously only been restricted. So we have a track record of its impact over the past 18 and a half years. Firearms that fall under 12.6 can no longer be sold. They cannot even be passed down as an inheritance. This has had the following effect. It depressed the value of collector firearms because there's no longer a market for these firearms, and it has amounted to imposing a slow-moving outright bans on firearms under 12.6. The draft legislation before you applies the same logic to all handguns. In reality, it imposes an eventual ban on all private, lawful ownership of handguns. Current owners will be grandfathered, but under this legislation, handguns could no longer be acquired by or sold to individuals or inherited by a licensed heir. But what problem is this legislation meant to solve? The data is unequivocal. Well over 90% of firearms seized in the commission of a crime or that are possessed unlawfully in Canada have been smuggled by organized crime from the United States. That should come as no surprise, since Canada adjoins the largest and most permissive gun market in the world. Almost anyone can acquire an array of handguns at a US gun show. This Liberal government came to power claiming it would engage in evidence-based decision-making. Instead, this bill amounts to decision-based evidence-seeking. Show me the data that supports this bill. There is none. Instead of being honest with Canadians and devising constructive policies that will actually curb the northbound torrent of crime guns from the United States, this bill constructs a false narrative against 4 million lawful, licensed, and background-checked firearms owners. With the exception of sensible new powers in the case of intimate partner violence or CBSA, this bill will do just about nothing to curb the rampant gun crime in Canada. However, it does ensure that only criminals will possess handguns. This is hardly reassuring for a government that has made it largely impossible to hold criminals on bail, even after multiple breaches of conditions, free once again to re-victimize law-abiding citizens. This legislation is a cynical ploy to polarize Canadian society by leveraging firearms as a wedge issue ahead of the next federal election. But that is par for the course for this government, with its robust track record of putting boutique electoral priorities ahead of the national interest. In over 20 years of studying public safety and national security across democratic countries, I have never seen a bill with this great a disconnect between its supposed means and ends. Any parliamentarian who votes in favor of this bill is going on record as disdaining evidence, supporting derision, fanning polarization, encouraging disinformation, and wasting scarce public resources on policy measures that miss their intended target. This bill does next to nothing to make the Canadian public any safer. It will neither solve nor prevent a single crime. Je vous remercie.
Thank you, Mr. Leuprecht. And finally, our last witness today is Dr. Kaylin Langman. You may proceed when you are ready, Dr. Langman.
Thank you for letting me present my research regarding Canadian firearms legislation and its association with homicide, spousal homicide, mass homicide, and suicide in Canada. I'm an assistant professor of medicine and emergency physician as well. I serve as an academic peer reviewer in the areas of firearms control and have 4 peer-reviewed publications on legislation and the effects of homicide and suicide in Canada. The relevance of my research regarding C-21. I demonstrated previous bans in the 1990s of a large number of semi-automatic rifles and handguns had no effect on homicide or suicide rates. Since 2003, the number of owned restricted firearms has doubled from 572,000 to 1.2 million. However, the rate of overall firearm homicide has not increased, nor has the rate of homicide by handguns. In the 1990s, legislation prohibited over 550,000 firearms, including military-style firearms and handguns. However, research has demonstrated that there was no statistically significant benefit on homicide, spousal homicide, or mass homicide rates. Restrictions on magazine capacity in 1994 was not associated with decreases in homicide or mass homicide rates, as well as red flag laws in the 1990s also had no associated benefit in terms of spousal homicide rates. Other jurisdictions, such as Australia and England, have also applied significant controls to handguns and semi-automatic rifles, with no statistically significant changes in homicide rates. Studies from the United States examining assault weapon bans also reveal no significant benefit. Lau et al. 2016 and Siegel 2020 found that these legislations were not associated with a decrease in victims. Interesting, when looking at 30 years of incidents, Blau found that shotguns were more associated with an increase in victims than semi-automatic rifles. Webster et al. In 2020 used a similar quasi-experimental methodology as myself, and did not find an association between assault weapon bans and mass homicide incidents or deaths. In summary, the evidence so far demonstrates that the proposed handgun and semi-automatic rifle bans will have no associated reduction in homicide rates or mass homicide rates. Methods that have been shown to be more effective in reducing firearms homicides involve targeting the demand side of firearms prevalence in criminal activity. As demonstrated by StatsCan, a significant percentage of firearms homicide involves gang violence, up to 50% that we know of. The evidence suggests that you need to act early to reduce youth involvement in gangs. A research report by Public Safety Canada in 2012 gathered evidence from programs operating in Canada to reduce youth gang participation and demonstrated beneficial effects in the ranges of 50% reduction in participation in gangs. The likely billions of dollars spent to confiscate firearms from legal firearms owners would probably be better spent on youth diversion and gang reduction programs, as well as programs in terms of suicide reduction and women's programs for leaving at homes at risk. Thank you for your time. Mr. Chair, I'd also like to add that I'm not speaking as the Director of Emergency Medicine Program at McMaster here. I don't know how that got on the Senate information, but I'm speaking as an assistant clinical professor of medicine at McMaster.
Thanks very much for that clarification, Dr. Langman, and thank you for your statement today. Colleagues, we'll now proceed to questions. We have to finish at 1:30 p.m. and as with the last panel, we will limit each question, including the answer, to 4 minutes. Please keep questions succinct and identify the person you're addressing the question to. I offer the first question to our Deputy Chair, Senator Dagenet, and I have Senators Boisvenu, Deakin, Ontario, O and Kuchar on the list currently. Over to you, Senator Dagenet.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Alors, ma première question va être pour Monsieur Langman. Monsieur Langman, quand il s'agit du contrôle des armes à feu, Les politiciens canadiens légifèrent généralement sous la pression populaire à la suite d'événements qui sont très médiatisés, entre autres comme la tuerie de Polytechnique à Montréal ou encore la tuerie survenue en Nouvelle-Écosse. Vous concluez dans vos recherches que le déclin du nombre d'homicides de masse par arme à feu au Canada depuis 50 ans n'est définitivement pas attribuable aux lois sur le contrôle des armes à feu, à la vérification des antécédents des propriétaires ou aux restrictions sur les armes militaires. Donc, selon vous, est-ce que c'est parce que les lois sont mal ciblées ou diriez-vous que peu importe les lois que le gouvernement va adopter, il est impossible de prévenir de façon absolue ce type de crime?
I'd say it's probably multifactorial. Number one, there's a high amount of substitution in terms of firearms acquisition. So as my colleague mentioned, a lot of firearms are obtained from the United States or from legal sources. And more we're seeing them produced at home or in many factories illegally. In terms of background checks and screening, there may be some work there in terms of making it more rigorous, and that is ensuring that it's actually being done. It may be that some people are slipping through because their background references are not checked. There's no way of performing studies in that regard, as that kind of data is unavailable. So that may be an area of focus, though it's probable that there will be no benefit in regards to that, as people can simply choose a reference or lie on their application if they need to. It's very difficult to predict who is going to commit an illegal act. You can use some background behavior as a prediction, but I do psychiatry all the time, and even predicting this is extremely difficult. There are no models to use. There's no clinical decision tools to use that will accurately predict this. The best we can probably use is the already existing prohibitions on ownership. And the question is whether those are actually followed up by the people placing the restrictions. So our probation officers following up on these prohibitions, it's going to be very difficult to follow that up, of course. But that's probably where you could get most of your benefit. The other place you could probably get most of your benefit is by reducing the number of youths that are getting involved in gangs early before they get deeply involved, and you're unable to get them out of that situation, and they're causing these types of crimes. And there's some good studies on that as
sorry to interrupt. We have to move on. Yes, Senator Boisvenu, followed by Senator Deacon, Ontario. Senator Boisvenu.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Alors, ma question va s'adresser à Monsieur Leuprecht. Vous faites une affirmation très, je dirais, très directe au début de votre présentation, de dire que ce projet de loi-là, dans le fond, cache l'intention réelle du gouvernement de se diriger vers une abolition totale des armes à feu au Canada. J'aimerais que vous m'expliquiez votre raisonnement, que je partage d'ailleurs. Hein.
Donc, la logique, c'est à travers le temps. Donc, si on regarde l'expérience qu'on a eue avec la section 12, les amendements de la section 12 qui étaient mis en vigueur en 2005, qui ont effectivement qui ont le résultat d'éliminer certains types d'armes. Et effectivement, ce qu'on a, c'est une expansion de cette logique et de cette approche qui, à travers le temps, va effectivement éliminer les armes à feu, la possession donc des armes à feu, parce que même si vous héritez une arme à feu, vous n'avez pas le droit d'hériter cette arme à feu, donc c'est-à-dire d'ici un certain temps, donc si ce projet de loi passe, les armes seront éliminées.
Et Monsieur Lagman, vous affirmez que toutes les mesures qui ont été prises au Canada depuis 30 ans, passons au registre des armes à feu de 1995, n'ont eu aucun effet sur la réduction des homicides. Et je le disais tantôt, la réduction des homicides a été plus forte sans le registre qu'avec le registre. Et là, on s'apprête à dépenser 1 milliard, donc ça va se rajouter aux 2 milliards déjà dépensés en 1995, qui n'a eu aucun effet. Ce milliard-là qu'on va dépenser pour acheter des armes à feu, est-ce que selon vous, ça va être la cause principale de concentrer dorénavant les armes à feu dans les mains des criminels au Canada?
I'm not sure about the translation, but the $1 billion spent will not go towards reducing any homicides or suicides in this country that will be measurable. And it's not just my research that demonstrates that, it's research from Australia as well. Australia went through this actual process where they banned a significant type of number of firearms, or 600,000 semi-automatic and pistols. And they saw in all the studies have shown no benefit in terms of reductions in terms of suicide and homicide. So overall suicide rates and homicide. So I think that $1 billion would be better spent on programs that will have a benefit. I mentioned one of those, which is targeting youth at risk. May also benefit in terms of getting help for people with suicidal ideation. This is something that I see every day as an emergency physician. I see people coming in with suicidal ideation from issues that they have in terms of depression, and it's extremely difficult to get them help. We look at wait times of over 6 months for some people. We have a shortage of physicians that are working in this area. I would strongly suggest that the government does a redirect and looks at those areas instead of confiscating firearms from people who are generally safe in the first place. They're screened already, have a very low risk of criminal behavior.
Merci, Docteur.
Thank you, Senator Dagenais. Senator Deacon, Ontario, over to you.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Me? Thank you. I wasn't sure if I'd missed the order there. Yeah. Thank you very much. And thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. Two very important perspectives. I'm coming back and thinking about that joint letter that was referred to earlier this afternoon. And in that letter that's signed, you expressed concerns around variance and suggested that we consider enshrining a definition in law using the definition proposed by Bill C-230, that a variant in respect of a firearm means that a firearm that has an unmodified frame or receiver of another firearm. I had a look at this bill and the debates in the House where it was defeated in an earlier parliament. Some of the concerns around defining a variant through legislation were that it could actually end up resulting in reclassifying thousands of firearms, and that many firearms would move unnecessarily from their present classification to a more controlled class. In other cases, it could put more dangerous guns on the market. So I'm wondering why, in fact, through this letter, you do not share these concerns.
Who are you addressing your question to?
Both of you. If you'd like to go ahead first, sir, that would be great.
So in terms of firearm variants, this is an extremely difficult area to determine, classify a firearm. So you have three types of firearms. You have basically an automatic firearm, a semi-automatic firearm, which reloads itself after a single pull of the trigger, and then you have sort of manual action firearms like a bolt action rifle. Bolt action rifles are very prevalent in this country and are probably the most powerful firearm available. They are not being looked at being restricted at this point. As an emergency physician, they're important to me because they fire a projectile that is traveling at a very high speed and often does more damage than a projectile fired from a handgun or even most semi-automatic rifles, which tend to use smaller calibers. So for me, it's rather irrelevant, really. All firearms are dangerous. I don't see one particular type of firearm any more dangerous than another. As I spoke to you already, other studies like Blau et al. Showed that shotguns are associated with a higher rate of victims in terms of mass shootings than other types of firearms, as can handguns be. I think that it's an area of semantics and it's relatively an area of irrelevance. You're talking about technical details, whether someone with any skills could modify these firearms and change it to one category to another. We have seen firearms that have absolutely no mechanisms that function as fully automatic, being classified as fully automatic. We have firearms that have no mechanisms that function the same as AR-15s that are being classified the same as AR-15s. So you're arguing over tiny little details when the really important stuff is going unnoticed.
Thank you. We have to move on, I'm afraid. We now go to Senator O.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, witnesses. My question is for Professor Christine Leuprecht. You mentioned about, you know, you have a powerful statement, and you know, for licensed people who owns a gun under the house, and you know, it curb nothing on this, on the handgun. I just wondering what happened, you know, if this bill is passed. So what happened to the value of the guns, and how can you get rid of it? Can you still sell it to someone, or can you sell it overseas? Or, you know, who is going to pay the loss of all this value and property of the, can you tell us that?
Well, in effect, it'll have the same effect as 12.6 had, which is will vastly diminish the value of any of these firearms, because the transactions, the transactions will effectively be prohibited. And so you've essentially reduced the market for these firearms. And there's many collector, for instance, handguns that would be captured under this, that, for instance, have significant value. So that's sort of one consideration, certainly, to keep in mind.
So can they turn to government and say, you buy all my properties, all my collections?
Well, I suppose government could try to put a value on this, but like as with many things that people collect, they collect them not for primarily for the value that this collection that it has, but because people collect things for sentimental and a whole host of other reasons. So you're essentially telling people that, you know, because you like particular types of firearms, many of which are never actually even fired because they're too old and precious, but you have to give them up and you can't collect these anymore because we don't value what you cherish in terms of collecting. Do we do this in other areas where people collect mementos?
Yeah. Do you believe that the government should put more funds and money into young gang violence, you know, to take care of, you know, more better laws and more enforcement on the gang violence?
So it turns out, Senator, today my new book with the University of Michigan Press on the Canada-U.S. border is being published, Security, Cooperation, Governance. And certainly there are many opportunities here for us to work closely, very closely with our colleagues in the United States. In many cases, ATF is our closest partner in identifying key sourcing of firearms into Canada. And yes, reducing culture. A lot of guns is around culture. This is what the legislation is essentially about. The legislation says that we don't want any sort of a culture associated with guns in Canada. And so in the same way, we can put money into reducing the gun culture that in certain sub-communities within Canada, where simply owning a gun, or what's known as packing, is simply part of the culture.
I have also seen CBC documentary that people walking over the Quebec border between U.S. and Canada, and we bag full of handguns. And do you think we should tighten up more on the border crossing?
Well, look, given the length of the border, I think any enforcement at the border is not going to be particularly useful. We ultimately need intelligence. We need to reduce the demand side within this country, in particular in communities that are at high risk, such as that communities that gravitate towards gangs. I don't think putting more money at enforcement at the actual border, but I think the significant opportunities exist for intelligence cooperation, in particular with our partners in the United States, that are not actively being harnessed.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Leuprecht. We go to Senator Kuchar next, followed by Senators Gerber, Youssef, and Cardozo. Senator Kuchar.
Thank you very much. This question is to Dr. Langman, and I apologize that it's quite long and complicated, so I'm going to read it because it's about precision and research. As you are aware, a recent Ontario study has showed that 2/3 of firearm-related deaths are from suicide, and that 70% of all gun-related deaths in Canada are suicides. And this is clearly not from criminal activity. 2016 to 2020, about 2,700 men in Canada died from firearm suicide. A prospective U.S. study of 26 million people showed that males who owned handguns were 8 times more likely to die by suicide, females 35 times more likely. Public health axiom is having access to lethal means as the primary cause for death by suicide. A Harvard University School of Public Health, in their summary of evidence, disagrees with your testimony. Quote, states with more key firearm laws had fewer firearm homicides, fewer firearm suicides, after controlling for poverty, unemployment, education, race, and non-firearm violence-related death, end quote. That's like hanging. They also noted, quote, some gun policy evaluations are designed to ensure that no effect will be found, end quote. They also noted, quote, the results of a flawed study should not affect policy, end quote. The Rand Institute report, What Science Tells Us About the Effects of Gun Policies of January 2023, noted that different types of legislation had different types of effects. They quote, the absence of evidence about a law can result from the law not having been studied or not being studied well. They noted that poor methodology results in erroneous conclusions. In your brief, you stated that your conclusions were, quote, based on sound statistical analysis and information, end quote. I read your PLS 01 paper, Effective Firearms Legislation on Suicide and Homicide, which your testimony is based on. And because I didn't want to review it myself for the committee, I asked experts to review it for me. And this is what they said, in part, that there were numerous problems with the methodology. And I'll just quote some of them. The application of the statistical difference in difference methodology is improperly applied. Another, that the parallel trends assumption that you use is not met in the data set. Another, that the stable unit treatment value assumption is also violated. They do point out, and senators will see this because I'll be circulating all this information to senators, in Figure 1 in your paper, you show a clear decrease in suicide by firearms for both males and females from 1980 to 2016. Also in your paper in Figure 2, you show a clear decrease in homicide by firearm for both females and males. They say, quote, the conclusion that increased firearm legislation does not decrease suicide nor homicide is not supported by the evidence presented by the author, end quote. And then they say, quote, the trends don't lie, but the author engaged in complex analyses and questionable assumptions to build a model to arrive at his desired conclusion, end quote. I wonder if you could respond to these concerns.
So it's not just me that has shown that so there's 2 different things, all right? Number 1 is that there's no effect on homicide rates in terms of the legislation that's been passed. I invite you to come and talk to me either by phone or by email and discuss these issues. You're presenting something with that I can't really respond to because I haven't seen it. However, it's not just me that shows that the legislation has had no beneficial effect. I submitted a brief looking at other Canadian studies which also show the same thing as I did. When you use the highest quality methodology, and my studies have been included in a Canadian Medical Association journal analysis and was rated as the highest quality studies, right? Above all the other studies that have been done on this country. When you look at those studies, there is no association using time series analysis in terms of homicide reduction and firearms legislation. Now, why do we use time series?
I'm sorry to interrupt. I've given you an extra piece of time to respond, but we if you want to come back to this later, we can, but I'm afraid we have to move on. I'm sorry.
Mr. Chair, basically, I've just been slurred and I can't respond.
Well, you may have an opportunity to do that with subsequent questions, but we have to move on. Senator Gerber, you are next.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Ma question s'adresse à Monsieur Leuprecht. Vous avez mentionné dans votre propos introductif que la majorité des armes à feu saisies provenaient des États-Unis, à peu près 90%. Ainsi, le projet de loi C-21 se tromperait de cible en se concentrant sur la situation canadienne et non sur nos voisins du Sud. Selon vous, quelles mesures ou dispositions pourraient être prises pour régler cette situation? Est-ce qu'il y aurait des solutions, des pistes de solutions? C'est ma première question. En d'autres termes, comment pourrait-on améliorer le projet de loi C-21 pour régler cette question?
Madame, je vous remercie de votre intervention et de votre question, une question très importante, parce que si on cherche tous à réduire le mal qui est fait par les armes à feu, et y compris donc la question précédente. Mais pour réduire le mal qui est fait par les armes à feu actuelles, on ne peut pas les réduire avec un projet de loi. La situation qui donne lieu qu'on a, donc c'est-à-dire notre voisinage auprès des États-Unis, les dynamiques individuelles des suicides ne sont pas des dynamiques qu'on peut régler par des lois, mais on peut les régler par des bonnes politiques publiques et des bons investissements des ressources qui sont à notre disposition. Je dirais donc, en particulier, une collaboration plus efficace, en particulier de la police fédérale, mais aussi un service de renseignement fédéral qui est mieux, avec meilleure capacité sur les armes à feu, ferait beaucoup plus pour imposer des contraintes au flou sérieux des individus, des groupes et même des vendeurs des armes à feu sur lesquels j'ai bien documenté dans ma propre recherche et mes propres articles, rendre plus de retombées que de cibler des personnes qui détiennent des armes à feu de façon parfaitement légale. Je crains forcément que ce projet de loi va encore plus diviser et polariser et mettre en cause la crédibilité des institutions démocratiques parmi un groupe qui a déjà beaucoup d'hésitations, en particulier auprès du gouvernement fédéral. Et donc, je crains vraiment que ce projet de loi va tout au contraire être instrumentalisé pour mettre en cause la crédibilité non seulement du gouvernement fédéral, mais aussi des institutions, y compris les services de renseignement et les services de l'ordre, donc y compris la police. Et je dirais donc, si on regarde l'expérience avec la GRC en tant qu'arme à feu, je dirais de s'investir dans la réforme de la GRC vous donnerait beaucoup plus de retombées que ce projet de loi.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that response. We now go to Senator Youssef to be followed by Senator Cardoso. And on round two, I have Senators Dagenet and Boisvenu, which should just about take us to the end of our remaining time. Senator Youssef.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for being here. My question is to Dr. Langman. I'm not sure if any of your research and data might shed light on the question I'm about to ask, but I want to ask about whether your research says anything about stolen legal handguns. I read statistics that almost 9,000 handguns were stolen between 2001 and 2006, most which was never recovered. Does your research have any indication where these guns might have ended up in Canadian society?
That's an extremely difficult question since we don't really have all that data. A lot of those firearms are missing. The question is, does the legislation that has been presented in the past is similar to the legislation going forward? Has that reduced firearms homicide in any way, or spousal homicide, or even mass homicide? And the answer is no. So the restrictions on the ownership of semi-automatic firearms, many of them were banned in the 1990s. Restriction on the ownership of certain handguns, many banned in the 1990s. That had no beneficial association in terms of firearm homicide. So the current legislation, which is proposing the same sort of ban, I don't see how that's going to have an effect going forward.
Well, my question wasn't about homicide. Just want to know if you had any data regarding where these stolen handguns might have ended up. Maybe one quick follow-up, Mr. Langman, if you may. In regard to C-21, is there any provisions in the bill that you see as worthy of public policy in regard to its objective?
I think perhaps only the legislation about so-called ghost guns. I don't think that there's any anything in this legislation that's going to have any benefit. The red flag laws, which I use myself occasionally, I do practice out of all the people here that you've had present, I'm probably one of the only people that actually uses this legislation as an emergency physician. I see this all the time. Currently, the legislation is easy to use. There may be benefit in terms of inserting into the legislation some protection for physicians or nurses or healthcare workers that report a patient. However, the red flag laws, both in my studies, show no benefit. Studied by Dr. Winterview in California, and their red flag laws have shown no benefit as well. I think that's about it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Cardozo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first, I just want to add to my colleagues the condolences to the family of Senator Shugart. In addition to being a colleague in the Senate, he served Canada with distinction as a senior public servant, which is where I first met him and worked with him at HRSDC. Clearly, we've lost a stellar public servant today. My question is for either of our witnesses, and I hear your strong objection to the bill. And this is partly, I guess, in follow-up to my colleague, Senator Youssef's question. Is there any parts of it that you feel are useful, especially in regards to intimate partner violence, which is a problem that it continues to grow, even though we have become so much more aware of it and are willing to talk about it in recent years and decades, but we don't seem to be able to deal with, to really get a handle on it or reduce it substantially. Are there any parts of this you feel assist in that area?
Why don't we have some brief reactions, and we'll start with Mr. Leuprecht.
Who are you addressing this to?
To both of you. So,
yes. So if we start with Mr. Leuprecht
first.
Senator Cardozo, and a very important topic. But I have yet to see, and of course I'm not aware of all the submissions that might have been made, a police service in this country that is asking for this legislation in order to reduce intimate partner violence. Intimate partner violence is a serious problem. But when it comes to firearm, as the previous panel already went through, the instruments at the disposal of law enforcement are already plentiful and seem to be working just fine. So, I would say that if we want to reduce intimate partner violence, maybe we should be looking at the loosening of bail restrictions and people who are coming to reoffend on previous victims, and that might have a much greater impact than having these superficial conversations about sort of how we could tweak the mechanics of firearms legislation and in the process demonizing 4 million law-abiding Canadians.
I don't think you meant to say that the current situation works just fine.
Just
yes, Dr. Langman, please go ahead.
To answer that question, I mean, the issue is, firearms are used in less than 1% of intimate partner violence. The partner who's at risk, they face the biggest danger at the time when they're about to leave. And in terms of what I see on the ground, we have a very low and limited supply of women's shelters and places for people to go. The second issue is, as my colleague mentioned, what is being done about people who have weapons prohibitions? It's very easy for the police to confiscate these firearms. I see it happen. I've called in myself to the CFO. But what is actually being done to ensure that someone is not going out and acquiring weapons or stalking that person? So you might want to look at actual on-the-ground approach to what you can do, rather than these high-minded legislations that mostly are going to affect people that have already been background screened. I mean, you're talking about a population in Canada that has been background screened, that has a very low risk of violence, and you're trying to squeak out a little benefit in that group, and you're not focusing on the group that is causing the problem. They're already prohibited from owning firearms. They're already prohibited from a firearms license. Yes, every now and then there is a rare event that happens where a firearm owner does commit a crime, but it's extremely difficult to predict, and it is extremely rare.
Okay, thank you very much. We have two senators to round out the session. We've got 3 minutes each for questions and answers. Senator Dagenet first, followed by Senator Boisvenu.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Une très courte question pour Monsieur Leuprecht. Monsieur Leuprecht, pouvez-vous nous donner votre opinion positive ou négative, évidemment, sur la disposition du C-21? Puis, est-ce qu'on a vraiment besoin d'une loi ou d'investissement dans les services de police pour lutter contre les armes illégales qui entrent encore facilement à partir? Parce que moi, je pense que C-21 n'aura définitivement aucun effet dissuasif auprès des criminels organisés.
Merci, Monsieur Dagenet. Juste pour clarifier avec le sénateur Cardozo, évidemment, ce que je voudrais communiquer, c'est que les instruments à la disposition de la police actuellement semblent être marchés pour atteindre l'effet, mais les conséquences que mon collègue a élaborées, on a plein de conséquences dans lesquelles le gouvernement pourrait s'investir pour garder les personnes plus sauves. Monsieur Dagenet, quant à la loi C-21, il me semble qu'en particulier en Ontario et au Québec, il nous manque un peu la présence de la GRC quant aux armes à feu. On a les plus grands flous à travers la frontière, y compris des flous des armes à feu. Et en gros, c'est la sécurité du Québec et la police provinciale de l'Ontario qui mènent ce dossier, parce qu'il y a largement absence de la GRC sur ce dossier quant à ces deux provinces-là, qui sont les populations qui sont d'un part avec le plus de population et qui sont d'autre part le plus proche vers des grands centres américains, donc où c'est assez facile d'importer donc des armes. Donc je dirais par exemple un investissement beaucoup plus systématique de la GRC pour coordonner en particulier au niveau de renseignement, parce qu'il y a forcément des limites, parce que la police provinciale peut juste coordonner avec les polices des États américains. Elle ne peut pas coordonner avec les partenaires fédéraux. Donc, il nous faut un beaucoup plus gros engagement de la GRC et en particulier en cibler les deux provinces, l'Ontario et le Québec, et les grandes villes dans ces deux provinces. Ça vous donnerait beaucoup plus de retombées que la discussion sur 21 qu'on a actuellement.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Senator Dagenet. And so we now go to Senator Boisvenu.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Ma question va être aussi pour Monsieur Leuprecht. Hier, le ministre de la Sécurité publique du Québec, le ministre Bonnardel, a annoncé un investissement de 28 millions dans les prisons québécoises pour mettre fin au fléau des drones. Le ministre a étiqueté la prison de Bordeaux de deuxième aéroport de Montréal. Ça dit tout. Donc, au moment où le syndicat des agents carcéraux canadiens demande depuis 8 ans des outils fiables, performants pour empêcher l'entrée d'armes illégales dans les pénitenciers, et que le gouvernement va dépenser 1 milliard pour acheter des armes légales, est-ce que vous ne pensez pas qu'à ce moment-là, le gouvernement, dans ses priorités, fait vraiment fausse route?
Comme vous le savez, monsieur le sénateur, donc, on se trouve dans une situation fiscale qui est très difficile pour le gouvernement actuel. Et donc, il faut être très prudent avec l'investissement des ressources publiques. Et il me semble que l'investissement d'1 milliard de dollars pourrait être dépensé de manière beaucoup plus efficace et économique pour atteindre beaucoup plus de retombées que de l'investir dans d'acheter donc des armes à feu des détenteurs des armes légales au Canada.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you. Thank you both. Senator Dasko, there is time for one last question, and you have it.
Thank you, Chair.
I am following up briefly on the comments in response to Senator Cardozo's question about domestic violence, and the comment that was made about police not requesting the provisions under the red flag laws in C-21. Now, I just wanted to ask both witnesses, certainly you are, or should be, or might be aware of many cases that we hear about where police disregard warnings and allow individuals to keep their guns despite clear risk factors that are known to police, including cases where the perpetrator might be subject to a restraining order. And I would suggest that this is why gun control advocates want less discretion on the part of police and are looking for measures, the type of measures that we see in 21. So I would appreciate comments from either of the witnesses about that. Thank you.
Senator Daska, as a member of our Police Services Board, let me say that this government has already downloaded significant costs in terms of public safety onto local communities. You can look at the police budget in Kingston just to have us to keep doing what the Kingston Police Service is doing. What this legislation will do is impose further requirements that effectively are being paid for by local communities with relatively little effect. And the reason why our police forces cannot achieve the objectives that you have laid out is because our police services are already overstretched and overtasked and underfunded for what we are expecting them to do. So if the government is prepared to also provide a cost equalization to the provinces to ensure that the costs on justice decisions such as this bill are being properly capitalized by provinces so that local municipalities can recover these costs from the federal government, then I'm happy for you, Senator, to support any law that you choose, provided my community doesn't have to pay for it out of our local tax dollars.
So you don't disagree with the premise of my question then? Correct?
We live in a democracy. And,
no, in terms of
you
the
have
fact
the right to decide.
In fact, that there are many cases where police disregard the warnings and do not take action. I would understand that you are agreeing with the premise and you're pointing to perhaps a reason why they don't, but you do agree then with what I'm suggesting.
Why don't we ask the Canadian Chiefs of Police whether they would agree with the assertion that you are making, and whether they believe that the proposition that you have put forward is an effective measure to deal with the particular challenges faced around these particular circumstances. But I would submit that this is perhaps not the appropriate instrument, and yet to impose yet further expectations on police and to demonize police for not applying legislation that they have. Senator Dasko, all the police officers that I know do their absolute best every day under the most difficult circumstances, and this government has made it more difficult for them to do their job. So to say that police are not doing their job is not acceptable, Senator Dasko.
Demonizing police, thank you.
We will leave it at that. Colleagues, this brings us to the end of our panel. I'd like to extend our sincere thanks to Mr. Leuprecht and Dr. Langman. We greatly appreciate your contributions here today, and this is an important issue, and you've helped us considerably as we move forward. So thank you for that, and we wish you both well, and we appreciate your work. Thanks. Colleagues, before we adjourn, I would like to turn your attention to the most recent report of the Subcommittee on Veterans Affairs that we discussed at last Monday's meetings. That's okay. It's okay. To return to the committee report, that was the subcommittee report discussed at last Monday's meetings. You should have all received a revised copy, and taking that into consideration with the version before you, are you prepared to adopt the report?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Is it agreed that the interim report of the Subcommittee on Veterans Affairs be adopted in both official languages?
Yes.
That the Chair be authorised to table the report in the Senate or with the Clerk of the Senate in both official languages at the earliest opportunity, and to request a complete and detailed response from the Government?
Yes.
That 24 hours prior to the release of the report be provided to targeted reporters under embargo?
Yes.
Colleagues, thank you. That brings us to the end of today's meeting. We will continue our examination of this bill on Monday, October 30th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time in room C-128. Thank you again for your participation. I wish you all a good afternoon in these very difficult circumstances today. The meeting, colleagues, is now adjourned.